Peace be upon you, and Allah's mercy and blessings. This is not a fictional story. It's a moment that shook an entire church and left hundreds of people questioning everything they had believed about Islam. A nun stood on the altar, her hands trembling not from fear but from rage, and with that rage she tore into the Quran, page by page. She thought she was silencing the truth. But then, a 17-year-old Muslim boy stood up. Not with anger. Not with hate. But with calmness, wisdom, and conviction. And what followed, no one in that church could ever forget. That day, in a towering church at the heart of downtown Chicago, the usual peace that filled its stained glass halls was replaced with a strange, restless energy. The sun filtered softly through the windows, painting the polished wooden floor with splashes of color. Families had come as they always did, mothers holding toddlers, elderly men gripping their canes, couples dressed in Sunday formals. The atmosphere was filled with quiet whispers, the rustle of coats, and the occasional shuffling of hymn books. But there was tension too. A whisper of something not quite right. On the raised altar, where warm sermons and blessings were usually shared, stood Sister Clara, a towering figure, both in presence and reputation. Known for her eloquence and leadership, Clara had spent decades within the church walls, guiding others, counseling the young, comforting the grieving. But today, her expression was different. Gone was the gentle smile. In its place, a grim resolve. Clara raised her voice. Her tone, once gentle and wise, now cracked with bitterness. Islam, she declared, is not a religion of peace. It is a religion of deception. Her voice echoed across the stone walls, sharp enough to silence the murmurs. The book they follow, the Quran, is filled with contradictions, false promises, and dangerous ideas. Some in the congregation shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others looked to her with wide eyes, caught between shock and loyalty. It was rare to hear such direct condemnation in this holy place. Clara did not stop. She held up the Quran in her left hand, her fingers tight around its cover. This book claims to be from God. But I will show you what it truly is, a man-made collection of confused thoughts and oppressive rules. With a dramatic pause, she turned a few pages, quoted verses without context, and laughed bitterly after each one. Polygamy? Holy war? Suppression of women? And you call this holy? Her voice grew louder, her pace faster. This isn't divine. This is dangerous. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience. Some nodded. Others looked away, visibly disturbed. Then Clara did something no one expected. She raised the Quran high above her head and tore out a page. The sound of tearing echoed through the microphone. Another page followed. Then another. Until torn fragments fell like ash at her feet. A wave of clapping rose from a few corners of the room. But most sat frozen. Conflicted. Unsure whether to cheer or cry. Outside, a boy was walking past the church gates. His name was Arif. He was 17. A thin, quiet student returning home from the city library, his backpack heavy with books, philosophy, comparative religion, world history. He walked with his eyes low, mind deep in thought. But then, a voice cut through the air. Loud. Angry. Hostile. His ears perked up. He slowed his steps. Turned his head toward the church doors. And listened. A book full of lies, the voice shouted. Arif's heart skipped. Another voice. Tear it. Tear the falsehood apart. He stopped completely. The words were too sharp to ignore. He turned fully and looked at the tall wooden doors of the church, slightly ajar. Without a second thought, Arif walked toward them. Inside, Clara was still on the altar, her hands now resting beside the torn Quran, her chest rising and falling as the adrenaline pumped through her. Around her, the room was in mixed silence and murmurs. Then the doors opened wider. A young man stepped in. Alone. Quiet. Every head turned toward him. A Muslim? Here? Clara narrowed her eyes at the boy's simple clothes, his modest appearance, the calm in his eyes. She scoffed, almost amused. You, she said with a cold smile. You came to defend your book? Arif looked around. Hundreds of eyes stared back at him, some filled with anger, others confusion, some curiosity. He stepped forward slowly. Stopped near the front row. Bowed his head gently, showing respect. Then he raised his gaze and said, in a clear and steady voice, I did not come to fight, sister. I came to clarify what you misunderstood. A stunned silence followed. Clara straightened her back. You want to speak here? She asked. This is a church. Not a courtroom. I understand, Arif replied. But truth does not belong to one building. It belongs to whoever seeks it. The congregation fell silent again. Even those who had clapped earlier now leaned forward. Something about the boy's voice, its calmness, its courage, made them curious. Clara folded her arms, nodding sharply. Very well. Say what you came to say. But be warned, I've read your book. I've studied your religion. And I know its darkness. Arif took a breath. And then he began. Sister Clara, you claim that the Quran is full of contradictions. That it misleads people. But may I ask, have you studied it with an open heart? Clara didn't answer. She only stared, waiting. You quoted verses out of context, Arif continued. Verses that appear strange if pulled alone. But any book, even the Bible, when sliced into fragments, can be made to sound confusing. He turned to the congregation. Have you ever asked why over 1 billion people follow Islam? Do you think all of them are deceived? Or could it be that we, as humans, often judge before we understand? No one moved. Sister, you tore pages of a book you don't believe in. But tearing paper doesn't erase truth. It doesn't shake the hearts of those who have read those words with sincerity. Clara clenched her jaw. Arif's voice softened. I invite you not to attack what you don't understand, but to ask, to listen. And if you find even one truth in what I say, just one, then maybe that truth deserves your time. The church was quiet. Even the air felt still. And Arif knew this was just the beginning. Clara's eyes narrowed. The calm confidence in Arif's voice unsettled her. She had expected anger, maybe even protest. But not this, not a young Muslim speaking with such poise, not in her church, not in front of her congregation. Still, she wasn't ready to back down. You speak well, boy, she said, her voice sharp like glass. But clever words don't change facts. I've studied your Quran. And I'll repeat it clearly, it contradicts itself. It says one thing in one verse, and another in the next. That is not divine. That's confusion. Some members of the congregation nodded slowly, encouraged by Clara's firmness. Others looked uncertain. The room was on edge, suspended between defiance and doubt. Arif remained steady. Then allow me to respond, Sister Clara, he said, turning to address the church once more. You claim the Quran contradicts itself. That it speaks in confusion. May I ask, can you give one example? Clara looked almost offended. One example? There are dozens. But fine. Here's one. In one verse your book says there's no compulsion in religion. But in another, it tells Muslims to fight disbelievers. Isn't that a contradiction? The room murmured. This was a common objection, and Clara delivered it with force. She folded her arms again, as if to say, checkmate. Arif nodded slowly, showing neither panic nor hesitation. That's a valid question, he replied. But only if we ignore the context. He turned his body slightly so more of the congregation could see his face clearly. Sister, the Quran was revealed over 23 years. Its verses responded to different events, different challenges, different enemies. Some verses were revealed in times of peace. others during times of war. He walked a step forward. The verse that says there is no compulsion in religion, that is from Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 256. And it is universal. Permanent. It means we cannot force someone to become Muslim. Faith must come from the heart, not the sword. He paused. The verses that mention fighting, those came at a time when Muslims were being killed, tortured, and expelled from their homes simply for believing in one God. Those verses gave permission to defend themselves, not to attack the innocent. Clara raised a brow. So you're saying your religion is peaceful? I'm saying it commands justice, Arif replied gently. And justice includes the right to self-defense, but with limits. The Quran forbids killing children. It forbids harming those who aren't fighting you. It forbids destroying trees, homes, places of worship. He took another breath. Tell me, Sister Clara, is that not more merciful than what we see in most wars today? Silence. The congregation was quiet again. People looked at each other, some thoughtful, others uncomfortable. The truths they were hearing challenged old assumptions. Clara wasn't finished. Even if that's true, she said, her voice quieter now, your Quran is still full of verses that are unclear. Why doesn't it speak plainly? Why does it feel poetic and hard to understand? If God wanted to guide us, why not write simply? Arif smiled slightly, not with mockery, but with compassion. That's a beautiful question, he said. And I want you to imagine something with me. He looked at the crowd again. Imagine you're speaking to every generation in every land, from the deserts of Arabia to the skyscrapers of New York, from the uneducated shepherd to the professor of science. Would you use only one kind of language? Clara didn't reply. The Quran speaks in layers, Arif continued. Its beauty is that it touches the heart of a child and the intellect of a scholar. Its verses are simple for the pure-hearted, and deep for those who reflect. And that's why millions study it for a lifetime, and still discover something new every day. The church remained still. A man in the second row leaned forward slightly, hands clasped. A young woman in the back frowned, but not with anger, with curiosity. Clara's posture loosened slightly. She had delivered her strongest point, but the boy had answered with thoughtfulness. Still, one more question burned in her mind. If it's such a perfect book, she asked, then why so many interpretations? Why do even Muslims disagree? Arif nodded slowly. Because humans have different minds, different languages, different histories. The Quran is perfect. We are not. He looked directly at Clara. But even with all those differences, Muslims around the world still agree on the core message: one God, one prophet, one book, one judgment day, and the call to righteousness, prayer, charity, and justice. He paused. Sister Clara, you said earlier that this book was full of lies. But I challenge you not to tear it again, but to read it. With the same energy you used to condemn it. Read it like someone searching, not like someone attacking. Clara's lips parted slightly, as if caught between response and silence. Arif's words carried a weight, not just of knowledge, but of sincerity. A man in the third row whispered to his wife, "Have you ever read it?" She shook her head, eyes still fixed on Arif. An old man sitting beside the aisle wiped his glasses and blinked, as if trying to see more clearly. The church, once echoing with Clara's bold claims, now felt like a place of listening. Arif gently reached into his bag and held up his own small copy of the Quran. This book, he said, was not written by a man. It was revealed, piece by piece, verse by verse, over 2 decades, preserved without change, memorized by children as young as 6, and it has guided hearts for over 1,400 years. He placed the Quran respectfully on the nearby podium, letting its presence speak for itself. I'm not asking you to convert, he said softly. I'm asking you to be fair. Clara looked at the boy in silence. She hadn't expected this. She expected rage, or blind loyalty, or silence. Instead, she got wisdom, calm, and truth that she couldn't dismiss so easily. One woman in the front row, clutching a gold cross around her neck, looked down at the pages Clara had torn earlier, still scattered like feathers at her feet. A deep discomfort filled her chest. She whispered, "Why do I feel guilty?" Arif stepped back. "I said what I came to say," he concluded. "The rest is between your heart and the truth." And with that, he stood still, letting the silence carry what words could no longer express. Clara stepped away from the altar for a moment. Her breathing had changed. Slower. Uneven. Her eyes scanned the room and then rested again on the boy who had disrupted her certainty. Her voice, though quieter now, carried a deeper sharpness, the kind born not just from defiance, but from desperation. "You say your Quran is without contradiction," she said coldly. "Then explain this polygamy. Your religion allows men to marry multiple women. Is that justice? Is that compassion? Is that what you call equality?" A few gasps rose in the room. Some members of the congregation nodded again, encouraged by Clara's renewed attack. Arif didn't flinch. He turned slightly toward the crowd, as if answering not just Clara, but everyone watching. "I understand why you ask this," he said gently. "Polygamy sounds strange to many. But let me explain what the Quran actually says, not what people assume it says." He paused for a breath. "Yes, the Quran allows a man to marry more than one wife, up to 4. But with one condition." He held up his index finger. "Only if he can be completely fair to all of them. Emotionally. Financially. In time. In love." He let that linger for a moment. "And right after giving that permission, Allah says clearly, if you fear you cannot be just, then marry only one." He glanced at Clara. "It's in Surah An-Nisa, verse 3. The crowd was listening closely now. "Islam does not command polygamy," Arif continued. "It only permits it in limited, difficult situations. During the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, many men died in battle, leaving behind widows and orphans. What would society do? Abandon them? Let women suffer alone in poverty? Or offer protection through marriage?" He walked a step forward. "Polygamy was never about pleasure. It was about responsibility. Islam didn't invent it, it existed long before. What Islam did was regulate it, limit it, make it just." Clara pressed her lips tightly. "So you're saying that's mercy?" Arif nodded calmly. "Yes. Mercy doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes, what seems strange in one culture is survival in another." A man in the 4th row, who had been sitting with his arms crossed since the beginning, now looked slightly less rigid. His expression softened as he murmured, "I never thought of it that way." Clara wasn't done. She took a step forward again, her voice rising, her tone sharper. "Fine. Let's say that's justified. Then answer this, Arif. What about jihad? Isn't that your religion's word for holy war? Isn't jihad the reason people fly planes into buildings? The reason the world fears Islam?" The room tensed. The very mention of the word, jihad, cast a dark shadow over the space. Everyone was silent again, waiting to see what this boy would say now. Arif didn't rush his response. He let the silence breathe for a moment. Then he asked gently, "Do you really want to know what jihad means, sister? Or just what the media told you it means?" Clara frowned but didn't respond. Arif turned once more to the congregation. "Let me be clear," he began. "Jihad does not mean holy war. That's a mistranslation. That's propaganda." A woman in the front row leaned in, eyes wide. "Jihad," Arif explained, "means struggle. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said the greatest jihad is the struggle within yourself, to control your ego, your anger, your greed. To fight your own darkness. He took another step, his voice gaining strength. Yes, there is also jihad of defense, to protect your home, your land, your people. But Islam places strict rules on that. No killing of children. No harming women. No destroying trees. No killing non-combatants. And never fight first. Always respond only if attacked. He looked around the room, slowly. Which other system of war ethics in the world is that clear? That strict? That moral? Clara clenched her fist slightly, but said nothing. And let me ask you, Arif continued, his tone softer again. What do we call it when soldiers defend their homeland here in America? Patriotism? Duty? But when Muslims defend themselves, it's terrorism. The silence deepened. He nodded. If a Muslim kills the innocent, that's murder. It's haram. It's a sin. And no verse in the Quran permits it. He reached into his bag again and opened a bookmarked page. The Quran says, whoever kills a person, it is as if he has killed all of mankind. That's from Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 32. Now even Clara's face had changed. The smug certainty was gone, replaced by something quieter, something closer to confusion. An old woman in the middle row wiped her eyes. No one knew if it was from emotion or embarrassment. Arif placed the open Quran gently on the podium again. Sister, he said softly, I know why you hate jihad. Because the word was twisted, abused, exploited by extremists and criminals. But would you hate Christianity because of the Crusades? Because of what some priests did to children? Clara blinked. That one hit deep. Arif lowered his eyes humbly. Every faith has people who misuse it. But don't judge the religion by its worst followers. Judge it by its book, by its prophet, by its message. He stepped back, giving space for his words to settle. Clara was breathing heavily now. Not out of anger, but because something inside her was cracking. Her walls were weakening. The congregation had changed too. There were no more whispered jokes. No smirks. Just silence. Eyes wide open. Hearts stunned. A boy of 17 had just dismantled the two biggest accusations thrown at his faith, and not once did he raise his voice. Not once did he insult. Not once did he defend with hate. He only used truth. The old man sitting near the aisle looked at Clara, then at Arif, then back at Clara. And for the first time in decades, he wasn't sure who was preaching the truth anymore. Clara's hands trembled slightly now. She had tried to strike at the core, first by accusing the Quran of contradictions, then by framing polygamy and jihad as injustices. But the boy's answers weren't just calm, they were clear, measured, unshakable. Each of his words had sliced through her assumptions like light breaking through fog. She looked at him, still defiant, but no longer proud. You speak as if your religion is perfect, she said, her voice lower than before. But tell me something, Arif. What about all these so-called miracles in Islam? Splitting of the moon? Talking ants? The night journey? Isn't it all just fairy tales for the simple-minded? Some of the congregation stirred uneasily. One man even chuckled under his breath. The room felt tense again. Arif looked at Clara, not with offense, but with sympathy. Sister, he said gently, every religion has miracles. Stories that seem impossible. Moses parted the sea. Jesus walked on water. Why are the miracles of Islam less believable than those? Clara frowned but said nothing. But let's take your question seriously. Arif continued. You mentioned the splitting of the moon. That miracle is recorded in Islamic tradition, and there are also historical accounts from distant civilizations that describe a strange celestial event around the same time. But even if we set that aside, let me show you something even greater. He took a small breath and opened his Quran again, flipping to a marked page. You asked about miracles. I want to talk about something you didn't expect, science. Now the room leaned in. Arif held the Quran up slightly, respectfully. This book, he said, was revealed more than 1,400 years ago. To a man who could neither read nor write. In a desert. At a time when people thought the sun revolved around the earth. He turned to Clara. So how could he know things that modern science would only discover centuries later? Clara crossed her arms. Such as? Arif didn't flinch. Surah Al-Anbiya, verse 30, Do not the disbelievers see that the heavens and the earth were joined together, then we split them apart? He looked around. That sounds very close to the Big Bang Theory, doesn't it? A murmur spread through the church. And in Surah Al-Mu'minun, verse 13 to 14, Arif continued, The Quran describes the stages of human embryonic development, in exact sequence, from a sperm drop, to a clinging clot, to a lump of flesh, then bones, and finally flesh covering the bones. He paused. Microscopes didn't exist in the 7th century. Embryology wasn't even a science. So how could a man living in the desert describe that so accurately? Clara was quiet now. Her expression had changed again, the eyebrows less arched, the jaw less tense. Something in her eyes betrayed what she didn't want to say out loud. Confusion. Arif's tone remained respectful but firm. You said the Quran contradicts science. But I say, it anticipated it. He turned a page. Surah Ar-Rahman describes the barrier between two bodies of water, one fresh, one salty, that meet but don't mix. Modern oceanography confirms this. We now call it the picnic line, a layer of separation due to differences in salinity, temperature, and density. But the Quran mentioned it 14 centuries ago. The old man in the back row sat up straighter. The young woman beside him leaned to whisper something, but her eyes never left Arif. Arif stepped closer, placing the Quran down again. This book isn't a science textbook, he said. But it has verses that challenge our understanding of the world, verses that led even non-Muslim scientists to admit, this couldn't have come from a human mind. Clara looked down, then back at him. Or maybe you're just interpreting it that way. Maybe those verses are vague, and you're twisting them to fit modern ideas. Arif nodded. That's a fair point, sister. People can twist verses. Muslims do it too. That's why we rely not just on the words, but on context, cross-references, language, and consistency. He leaned slightly forward, not threatening, but as if inviting her to come closer to the truth. I'm not asking you to believe blindly. I'm asking you to ask yourself, how could an unlettered man, with no access to microscopes or telescopes, speak of such things with such precision? Clara's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Arif smiled softly. If a man writes a book of poetry, we call him a poet. If he writes a book on war, we call him a general. If he writes about astronomy, medicine, ethics, law, and the soul, in perfect harmony, then what do we call him? A silence fell over the church again. One woman in the middle row covered her mouth. Another clutched the Bible in her lap, as if holding on to something slipping away. Arif looked at Clara once more. Miracles don't always mean walking on water. Sometimes the miracle is a book, untouched, unchanged, unmatched, that stands for 14 centuries and still speaks to every heart that truly listens. A few people lowered their heads. Not out of shame, but reflection. Even Clara now seemed smaller behind the altar. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her thoughts were louder than her voice. She had come to lead a charge, but now the ground beneath her was shifting. She finally managed to ask, So you believe this book has all the answers? Arif shook his head. No. I believe it has all the questions we need to ask, and the guidance to find the answers. But only if we're honest with ourselves. Then, with a voice full of sincerity, he added, You tore pages from the Quran. But what truly matters isn't what your hands tear, it's what your heart refuses to open. Clara stood frozen. And in the silence that followed, something in the church shifted. For the first time, the people weren't looking at Clara for guidance. They were looking at Arif. Clara stood quietly behind the pulpit, her hands gripping its edges. She had hurled her sharpest accusations: contradiction, polygamy, jihad, and miracles. And yet the boy in front of her remained composed, each response slicing through her certainty like a slow, deliberate wind. Her voice, once a weapon, now sounded uncertain, hollow. But then, as if finding strength in one final strike, she looked up with a spark of old fire in her eyes. "All right," she said. "Let's talk about your laws." Arif met her gaze, respectful as ever. Clara's voice was steady again, but colder now. "Islam teaches the cutting of hands for theft. Flogging for adultery. These are not punishments, they are barbarity. How can a religion that claims mercy also promote cruelty?" The congregation stiffened. This was it, the most sensitive, the most controversial accusation. Even those who had been moved by Arif's earlier words now tensed. This topic had been whispered about for years, sometimes with confusion, sometimes with horror. Arif stayed silent for a moment, letting the gravity of the question hang in the air. Then he nodded. "Sister Clara," he said softly, "you've asked a very important question. And I'm grateful you did, because many people wonder the same, but are too afraid to ask it." He stepped forward slowly, his hands calm by his sides. "But before we talk about the punishments," he continued, "let's talk about justice." He turned to the crowd. "What is justice? Is it letting people steal freely? Is it letting rapists walk free because they have a good lawyer? Or is it about protecting the innocent, the weak, the victims?" Clara folded her arms tightly, watching. "Islamic law, known as Sharia, isn't designed for vengeance," Arif explained. "It's designed to protect, to prevent, to deter. And its punishments are not meant to be easy, because crime is not easy for the victim." He walked toward the front pews now. "The Quran commands the cutting of a thief's hand in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 38. But do you know how many conditions must be met before that is even considered?" A man in the back muttered, "What conditions?" Arif looked up. "First, the theft must be deliberate, not hunger, not desperation. Second, the stolen item must be of significant value. Third, there must be no doubt. Fourth, the society must already be just, where every citizen has access to food, work, safety. Only then can justice be applied." He paused. "And even then, forgiveness is always better." Clara narrowed her eyes. "But still, cutting someone's hand?" Arif didn't flinch. "It sounds harsh," he admitted. "But how many people today steal without fear? Corporations, banks, politicians. How many children suffer because someone richer thought they'd never be caught?" He took a breath. "The goal is not to hurt. The goal is to stop the hurting." The room was quiet again. "You want to talk about flogging?" he asked, turning toward Clara gently. "Islam commands that too, for public immorality, not for private sin. But even then, do you know how many witnesses are required to make it valid?" He raised 4 fingers. 4. 4 people must witness the act clearly. If even one is missing, the punishment cannot be carried out. And if someone falsely accuses, they themselves are punished. A woman in the third row leaned back, visibly shaken. She whispered, "That's stricter than what I thought." Arif nodded. "These laws weren't created for chaos. They were designed to build order, stability, safety. Imagine living in a society where you never lock your door at night, where a widow walks safely at midnight, where no one cheats you because they fear God more than the law." Clara's eyes softened. "But isn't that fear?" Isn't that forcing people to behave through punishment? Arif's voice lowered now, tender, reflective. No. It's reminding people that actions have consequences. And the goal isn't punishment, it's prevention. That's why in Islamic history these punishments were rarely applied. Not because they were hidden, but because the system worked, people were fed, helped, educated, supported. He looked around the church. Which is more cruel, a punishment that prevents 1,000 crimes, or a freedom that allows evil to flourish? Silence. He stepped back toward the pulpit again. And even then, he added, Islam always opens the door to mercy, forgiveness, repentance. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, once stopped a punishment because the accused repented sincerely. He said, avoid applying punishments whenever you can. If there's a doubt, let it go. It's better to err in mercy than in severity. Tears were forming in a woman's eyes near the center aisle. An elderly man near the back sighed heavily, as if burdened by everything he had just learned. Clara looked down. This was not the debate she had prepared for. She thought she would expose a religion. But instead, she had seen it revealed, not by argument, but by truth. Not by force, but by patience. And now, even her final weapon, the charge of cruelty, had dissolved in front of her, replaced by something she hadn't expected. Wisdom. Arif stood still, his hands folded gently in front of him. I don't ask you to agree with everything, he said quietly. I only asked you to look again, not with anger, but with fairness. He took a long pause, his eyes scanning the room. The Quran says, we sent you not, O Muhammad, except as a mercy to all the worlds. That's what Islam is. A mercy. But mercy begins only when the heart is willing to listen. Clara said nothing. She could feel something inside her starting to unravel, not her pride, but her walls. All the ideas she had believed, all the claims she had made, all the confidence she had stood on, now shook beneath her. The congregation, too, was no longer on her side. They weren't clapping. They weren't nodding. They were thinking, reflecting, and slowly opening. The air inside the church had changed. It was no longer filled with the echo of Clara's bold voice or the rhythm of applause. Instead, there was a strange, weighty stillness, like the final seconds before a storm breaks or a soul begins to surrender. Every eye that once looked to Clara with admiration now turned toward her with quiet confusion. Not hatred. Not ridicule. Just questioning. Clara gripped the sides of the pulpit as if it were the only thing holding her up. She opened her mouth, perhaps to argue one last time, to salvage what pride remained. But no words came. Her throat tightened, and something unexpected pressed against her chest. Was it doubt? Fear? Or something far deeper, a truth she had locked out for too long? Arif stood quietly, not speaking. He knew the silence was now louder than anything he could say. He had seen this before, not here, not with a nun in a church, but in the eyes of people who'd built their lives on falsehoods without realizing it. Until one moment breaks them. And that moment was now. Clara finally spoke, her voice hoarse. Is what you said really in your book? Arif nodded gently. Every word. She lowered her gaze, unable to look him in the eyes. And all this time, I was taught the opposite. From the pews, a quiet murmur rippled like a soft wind. The congregation was shifting, spiritually, mentally, emotionally. No one dared to stand. No one dared to applaud or challenge. The battle had ended, but no one had won. Because the truth wasn't about victory. It was about surrendering to something greater. In the back row, an old man who had earlier cheered Clara's words now leaned forward. He held his head in his hands, whispering to the man beside him. What if we've misunderstood everything? The man beside him didn't answer. He just stared straight ahead, pale and silent. A young woman sitting in the front clutched the cross around her neck. Not tightly, but thoughtfully. Her eyes were glossy. Her thoughts were racing. Why have I never heard any of this before? She whispered to herself. Clara was still frozen behind the pulpit. Her hands, once raised in anger, now trembled beside her. Her voice returned in a fragile whisper. So many years, I stood here, telling people that Islam was a lie, that the Quran was violent, that Muslims were misled. She looked around the hall, then back at Arif. Her lips quivered. But you didn't come here to insult me. You didn't shout. You didn't even defend with anger. You just answered. Arif's voice was low and calm. Because truth doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be clear. Clara took a step back from the pulpit, then stumbled slightly. A few people in the front row rose instinctively, unsure whether to help her or simply stand with her. She held out a hand, not to push anyone away, but to steady herself. I don't know what I believe anymore, she admitted, her voice cracking. All I know is, something inside me is breaking. Tears welled in her eyes. She tried to blink them away, but they fell anyway. And with those tears, the entire church saw something they had never seen before. Not a nun. Not a leader. But a human being, stripped of certainty. Arif stepped forward slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move in triumph. He simply stood a few feet away and said, Sister Clara, the Quran is not here to humiliate you. It's here to heal. She looked at him, broken. And after all I've said? After what I did? He shook his head. Allah is more merciful than any of us can understand. No matter what we've done, as long as the heart turns sincerely, the door of truth never closes. The congregation was silent. Some wept quietly. Others sat stunned, unable to believe what they were witnessing. A man rose slowly from the third row. He was tall, in his late 60s, with silver hair and sunken eyes. His voice trembled as he spoke. I came here today to hear my sister preach. But instead, I heard a stranger speak truths I never knew. He looked at Arif. I want to read that book, he said firmly. The one you spoke from. Another woman stood up. Me too. Then another. And another. In a matter of moments, dozens of hands were raised across the church. People were no longer interested in debate. They wanted to know. They wanted to read. They wanted to understand the book they had feared. Clara watched all of it in silence. Her heart swelled with emotions she couldn't name. Regret. Relief. Guilt. Curiosity. Hope. Finally, she whispered, I don't know where to start. Arif reached into his bag once again. He pulled out a small, worn copy of the Quran. Its pages had been read many times. Its corners softened by prayer. He stepped forward and held it out to her with both hands. Clara looked at the book for a long time. Her fingers trembled as she reached out. When she touched it, something inside her shifted. Something heavy lifted. Something deeper awakened. She accepted the book. I promise, she whispered, I'll read it. Not with anger. Not with fear. Just with an open heart. Arif smiled, not with pride, but with peace. That's all truth ever asks, he replied. In that moment, the grand church, once filled with tension and accusation, became something else entirely. A place of stillness. Of questions. Of beginnings. The church had never felt like this before. It was no longer a hall of judgment, no longer a courtroom of dogmas. It had become a space of pause, a breath before a new beginning. The once defiant stained glass windows no longer glared down in silence. Now they bathed the room in gentle, shifting color. And in the middle of it all stood Clara, a nun once furious, now broken open, and holding a Quran in both hands like it was a newborn truth. She didn't speak. She couldn't. The pages she had once torn in fury were now in her hands again, this time whole. sacred, intact. Her tears weren't loud. They fell silently, like raindrops in an empty hall, but every soul there could feel the weight behind them. The congregation sat still, eyes fixed not on Arif now, but on Clara. And that, more than any debate, more than any verse, more than any argument, that was what moved them. That this woman, who had once stood tall above them as a leader, had now bowed her head, not in shame, but in surrender. Not to a person, but to something her heart had just begun to see. Arif said nothing more. He stood silently near the steps of the altar, his head slightly bowed in quiet respect. There was no need for victory. No need for applause. He had not come to win a war. He had come to let the truth speak for itself. And it had. One by one, members of the congregation began to stand. Some stepped forward, some whispered prayers they didn't yet understand, and others simply wept, not for loss, but for what they had just found. An old woman in the third pew held her granddaughter's hand and whispered, "I never knew Islam could be this gentle." A teenage boy leaned into his father's side. "He's younger than me," he whispered about Arif. "But he spoke like a scholar." A middle-aged man approached Arif with trembling hands. Can I get one too?" he asked, nodding toward the Quran in Clara's hands. Arif reached into his bag again. "Of course," he said softly. Then another asked. And another. Within minutes, every extra copy Arif had was gone, passed from hand to hand like torches lighting a dark corridor. But still, Clara said nothing. She stared at the Arabic words on the open page in front of her, not understanding them with her eyes, but feeling them settle deep into a place she hadn't visited in years, her soul. And then, finally, her voice returned. Fragile. Whispered. "Arif," she said, her eyes still downcast. "You didn't defeat me today." Arif looked at her gently. "I didn't come to." She nodded. "But you did something far greater. You made me see." A pause. "And I don't know what happens next." Arif smiled faintly. "That's the beauty of truth, Sister Clara. It doesn't demand certainty. Only sincerity." Clara's hands closed the Quran slowly. She held it to her chest, not like a scholar or a priestess, but like someone holding something precious for the very first time. Her black robe now stained with tears, her posture no longer upright with arrogance, but bowed with humility. The same hands that once tore pages, now cradled them. She stepped down from the altar slowly. Each step echoed with memory, with reflection, with change. She did not preach. She did not instruct. She simply walked toward Arif. She stood in front of him, eyes still wet. "Will you pray for me?" she asked. Arif nodded. "Every day." "And for them?" she added, glancing at the congregation. He followed her gaze. "Them too." In that moment, something sacred had passed between them, not religion, but humanity. Not conversion, but awakening. The congregation continued to rise. Some held each other. Others closed their eyes. And many stared at the young boy who had said little, but had said enough to make centuries of prejudice tremble and crack. Then, without another word, Arif picked up his empty bag, now light from the absence of books, and turned toward the door. The same door through which he had entered in silence, now became his exit, quiet, respectful, unchanged in his humility. As he walked past the pews, no one tried to stop him. But every eye followed him. Not like a celebrity. Not like a warrior. But like a traveler carrying something too vast for words. He stepped outside, into the soft light of the late afternoon. The street outside was still bustling. Cars passed. Birds flew. But inside the church, time had paused. Clara remained at the altar, her hands never letting go of the Quran. She didn't tell anyone to believe. She didn't preach. She just stood there, a symbol of something no one could ignore. And the congregation, once full of certainty, now full of questions, understood something deeper than words could say. That sometimes, all it takes is a whisper of truth in a house of noise to change everything. And on that quiet Sunday in downtown Chicago, in a place where hate once echoed, hope was born. Not through force, not through fear, but through the truth. And the heart that dared to listen,